Dr. Folsom.
Thank you. Thank you, Anna. Let me give you a hug. Thanks. Good to be here. Good to be here with all of you talking about U.S. history. Yeah. How many? Maybe some of you have a U.S. history course right now. Some of you. Good. I hope to give you some ammunition that will help you. U.S. history, a tremendous area to study and learn about this country. I'm going to be looking especially about the rise of the United States to being a world power in the 1800s. We go from being a second-rate power to a first-rate power. Now, what are some of the ingredients? Well, one of the ingredients has to do with the national debt. As you know, and as we've seen the last few years, when the debt goes up, 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 economic development goes down and progress slows. Yet, right at the first in our history, we had a national debt in George Washington's presidency, left over from the Revolutionary War, right? The British didn't go down for free. It cost guns, ammunition, food, equipment for the soldiers. All of that had to be paid. Some of that the French loaned us. Some of that our own people, our own patriots, loaned money. We had a debt of $74 million, which doesn't seem so huge today, but keep in mind the average person in George Washington's time made about $100 a year. We had not had Federal Reserve inflation. Money really meant something, and if you earned $1 a day, that was huge wealth. So if you owe, see, we're only a nation of 3 million people. If you owe $74 million, that's about 3 months' work for everybody in the country, free, just to pay the debt off. It was huge. And a lot of people said the United States' survival depends on our ability to pay the debt off. I wanted to quote from George Washington in his farewell address. He'd been in president for 8 years. He leaves office. In teaching at Hillsdale College, we teach American history with a series of documents from the original sources. You know, it's not a textbook in some historian's opinion. You read the original documents, the original sources, from John Winthrop and the Puritans to George Washington up through Abraham Lincoln, Franklin Roosevelt, Ronald Reagan, and so on. You read the original sources, and then we talk about those, and we evaluate them in class. Here's one of our sources. It's from George Washington's farewell address, and he talks about debt. He'd been trying during his 8 years as president to cut it down. Here's what he says: avoid the accumulation of debt. Wow. He has 2 sentences there. Avoid the accumulation of debt. Then he says, not ungenerously throwing upon posterity the burden which we ourselves ought to bear. Not ungenerously throwing upon posterity the burden which we ourselves ought to bear. What's posterity?
Future generations.
Future generations. Absolutely. Us. And our parents and grandparents, but the generations that were to come after Washington. Now, reading that again. So he says, avoid accumulation of debt, not throwing upon posterity, us, the burden which we ourselves ought to bear. Now, that's rather remarkable. Washington sacrificed, as did his generation, to win the Revolutionary War. They then, 10 years later, Washington presided over the writing of the Constitution. And now we have a debt from the war. And I don't know if anybody would have begrudged him if he'd have said, look, generations to come, we got the British off your backs and got you independence. Then we wrote a document that provides for freedom for everybody. Now why don't you join in and pay off some of the debt? Right? Help out, kick in. It would have been hard to argue if he had said that. But he didn't say that. He said, avoid accumulation of debt, not ungenerously, throwing upon posterity the burden which we ourselves ought to bear. He said, we ought to pay it off and then let our children and our grandchildren have a head start with no debt and a document of liberty, the Constitution, and independence from the British. He's not the kind of politician who says, let's spend now and then have our children pay the debt later. He's saying, let's pay it all now and then give our children pure freedom and let the nation develop in an atmosphere of freedom. That's one of the reasons George Washington was at least one of our greatest presidents, if not our greatest president. He set the tone. And listen, he's saying our generation ought to do it. And when George Washington says that, those who follow are obligated, sort of, hey, he set the vision, he set the goal, he had the tone. Who comes next? Adams. We reduced the debt some more. Then who's next? Jefferson. We cut the debt some more. Who's after Jefferson? Madison. Yeah. We're getting to Quincy. But Madison comes first and then Monroe. Then who? Quincy. John Quincy Adams. Then Andrew Jackson. And under Andrew Jackson in the 1830s, the United States completely paid off its debt and was running a surplus so that we were taking more money in than we were spending, and we had a national surplus, not a national debt. Hey, let's hear it for the generation, that first generation, okay? Thank you. And James Madison was still alive when this happened. So Washington wasn't. But some of the members of that founding generation were still alive when we paid the whole thing off. And we gave the future generations complete independence, no more British, and no national debt. We were running surplus. In fact, under Andrew Jackson, one of the issues is, what do we do with all this money? And they had a debate in Congress what to do with it. And one of the debate was, well, we're spending this much on the Capitol and the building and that sort of thing, and on the post office, and then we're taking in this much. And there was no income tax, right? It was just, we're taking it in on tariffs, a tax on imported goods. So we were doing that and selling a little bit of land and getting some money there. And you've heard of the whiskey tax, a little bit of that, excise tax, but not very much in the way of taxes. And we're spending here and taking in this. And we had a surplus. And so what do? Some people were, well, let's give it back to the states in proportion to their population, and that's what we did. Every state at the end of the year got free money from the government that was leftover surplus. Now, Hillsdale College, where I teach, is in Michigan, which was not a state. And I was doing some reading in the history of Michigan, and the governor was saying, oh my gosh, a territorial governor. We need to think about being a state so we can get some of this free money. And so Michigan wrote in and said, can we get free money? We're a territory. And they said, no, you're not a state. And we said, if we become a state, do we get free money? And they said, yes, according to how long you've been a state. In other words, if you come in the middle of the year, like June or July, you get half a share. Right? If you come in December, you get a 12th of the free money. And we said, okay, and we had a meeting, and that explains why Michigan became a state in 1837, January. We wanted all that we could get because we were running surpluses, and every state that came in received part of that surplus. A tremendous era in American history. And it kept going through the 30s. And we come into the 1830s and 40s, and we had Congress who said, you know what, I know the surplus is a good thing for the nation. And it creates entrepreneurs an environment of freedom to invest because they don't have any very low taxes, and we don't have debt that is strangling us through interest rates and repayments and all of this. So we were prospering tremendously. But they said, there were some people who were saying, I think we ought to change policies. And it was going to, the debate over whether we change and borrow and go into debt revolves around a strange issue. I mean, it may strike some of you strange. The steamship. You know, I looked around, there was nobody going, oh yeah, obvious. No, it isn't. Except it is. The steamship was the internet of the 1830s and 40s. It allowed us to reach people that could not be reached easily before, at least reach them more quickly. Let me give an example. When Christopher Columbus came over to the New World, and he made several voyages, it was taking him 2 to 3 months to come over here. And then it would take 2 to 3 months to go back. That 2 to 3 months was still the same in the 1800s, the early 1800s, before the steamship, because you're dependent upon wind power, and if the wind goes, you go pretty quickly, and if it doesn't go, you don't go so quickly, and you're dependent on that all the way over and back. And with the steamship, you can use mechanical power. See, this is part of the Industrial Revolution. Mechanical power to go through the ocean quickly, fast, in a quick time. So, see, in the old days, before the steamship, if it took 2 to 3 months to come over to here and 2 to 3 months to go back, I mean, think if you're an immigrant, you have to have a 3-month food supply or else buy it on board. You've got to pay the ticket. The crew needs to be paid and fed. It made it hard to do trade internationally. Expensive. It made it expensive. We didn't get as many immigrants. But now with the steamship, all of a sudden, plowing through the ocean, we can go in about 12, 13 days, less than 2 weeks, overseas. This is the month of March. Let me put this in perspective. That means on March 1st, we could leave New York City, go to Liverpool, England, drop a load of materials off, or passengers, pick up another batch of passengers, mail or freight, come back to New York City, and it's still March. It's cheaper, it's more economical, you don't need as much overseas costs. You don't even need the insurance because you're not on the sea as much. So you don't need as much insurance. And so everything is cheaper. The immigration is going to come into the United States at a greater rate because of this. It was a dramatic impact on history. Now, England was leading the way in the steamship business, and a lot of Americans said, hey, we Americans ought to get into this business. England is way up here, leading the way in industry, and we're down here. What we need is to stop this business of having surpluses and find someone who could really be good in the steamship, invest in them, plow that money into them, then we'll catch up with England, and maybe later we can go back to having surpluses. But in any case, use that money to invest in a steamship company so that we can be internationally competitive. Wow. We had a big debate in Congress in the 1840s. One man named Edward Collins came before Congress and said, I know how the steamship business works. If we were to do this, we could catch up, I think, with England. It would be good, even though I know it would cost money to do that. We might not be able to have surpluses anymore. The advantage would be that we would jumpstart our economy. We'd use the government to help entrepreneurs. And then he said, I volunteer to receive the subsidy. I'll do it. And a lot of Congress said, well, what would you need? And he said, well, look, I've done some figuring, and I figure to get started, I might need a subsidy of $385,000 a year. At least the first year. Now, I don't know what would be the second year. I hope nothing, maybe. But I mean, the point is, I would start with a subsidy of $385,000, and that, of course, would not necessarily put us in debt, but that would be what I would need. 385, let me use the green, it might make that a little bit. And Congress said, well, you know, we might still be able to run a surplus. And then he said, well, maybe, but I'll need $3 million to build the ships. He said, I'll build 4 ships. And he said, listen to this. I'll have 2 of the ships over in England, over here. 2 of the ships over in New York. Then I'll have 1 of the ships go from New York, right, all the way over to England. And it's going to take it 12 days. So at the end of a week, it'll be about here, and then 2 weeks here. But then I'll have another ship going from England, 1 of those 4, at the same time, Monday morning. So we'll get 1 ship coming here, 1 here. At the end of 2 weeks, this one will be well over here, and it can be refurbished and sent out again. And then this one will be over here, and it can be sent out again. And then we could do the same thing with the other 2. So the point is, we can always have a regular Monday morning shipping going out. If I have 4 ships. Now that'll cost $3 million. Plus the $385,000. And so Congress had a difficult decision. They said, whoa, do we want to go in debt? And he said, yes, but if you do it, we'll catch up with the British and it will be so good for the country. Congress debated this difficult decision. Do we go into debt? One person said, well, is this constitutional? And Collins said, whoa, I've got to look in the Constitution. And then he found out that the Constitution didn't say anything about subsidizing companies at all. That wasn't permitted. But it did say that talk about post office roads. He said, I'm delivering mail. In fact, he called it's the Collins Mail Steamship Company. And so therefore it's constitutional. Congress debated this, and they gave Mr. Collins the $3 million to build the ships. We went into debt, and we paid him the $385,000, and he began that business to and from England, delivering mail, passengers. He had passenger rates, freight rates, mail rates, all of this. Took it to England and back. At the end of a year, delivering the mail. He had completed it. He came back to Congress at the end of the year. Congressmen were shaking his hands. You did it! And he said, I did it, yes. However, I had startup costs that I didn't anticipate. And it took me half a year to get people to know I was around. And so I didn't have full ships. So next year I'll need a subsidy of $400,000. Congress gave him the $400,000. Collins continued in business. He was charging about $120 for a fare to England and back, making some money. Losing some money, though. He had to want to have one of his ships recalked. It was out of service for a while. So the next year he came to Congress and said, I'll need $500,000. The next year he said, due to circumstances beyond my control, I need $600,000. In other words, the amount kept going up. After several years of this happening, a man named Cornelius Vanderbilt, nicknamed the Commodore, who had steamships of his own, said, I think I'm going to enter this contest. And he went up to Congress and said, I'm not sure what Collins is going to ask for this year, but whatever he asks for, I'll do it for half price. Collins came up, asked for a $700,000 a year subsidy. We're going to test your math skills. How much did Vanderbilt say he would do it for? $350. Very good. So now this makes it interesting, doesn't it? Vanderbilt says he'll do the steamship trade for $350,000. Collins says, I'll do it for $700,000. Vanderbilt says, I'll do it for half price, $350,000, which was less than the original. Now Congress has to have a debate. Do we accept Vanderbilt's offer? And I have a question for you. How many of you think Congress accepted Vanderbilt's offer to do it for half price and save some money and maybe start getting surpluses again? Now, what's this? No, okay. Now, okay, let me see. 1, 2, 3, okay. A sprinkling of people. How many think, no, they did not? Okay, you say they don't. Actually, this whole front row. What's this front row? Everybody says no? Let me see those hands. How many say no, they wouldn't take this offer to do it for half price? An overwhelming majority of you say Congress did not take Vanderbilt's offer. And in this case, the majority is correct. Which raises the question, see, this was the subject of the first chapter of my book, The Myth of the Robber Barons. And I went to the Congressional Record, back then it was called the Congressional Globe, and was doing research because I thought, why would they do that? What do you think I might find? What would Congress say the reason would be when they're defending that? Because you have to defend your vote. Yes, sir.
I believe they did because we've been with him. We have.
Yeah, speak up because you're definitely on the right track here. Go ahead.
They probably figured we've been with him for this many years. We have a history with him. We know he can deliver what he somewhat promises, so we will continue funding him.
I like that. We know he can deliver somewhat what he promises. Did you catch that? That was good. In fact, I'd like to give you a free book for that answer. What's your name?
I already have that.
You have it!
You can throw it at someone else.
Do you have this one too?
Yes, sir.
You can throw it at someone.
I'll take it.
Come up afterwards. We'll find some way to reward you. That was a good answer. He's completely right. Adam is completely right. What happened was Congress said, we know Collins can do it. We don't even know if Vanderbilt can actually do it. He says he can do it. We don't even know if he can, and we've been going with Collins all of these years. And so they, by a very strong vote, they voted to continue the subsidy to Collins. Now, Collins was all happy about this. You know, he was going to the port in New York, and I want him a vote, get a subsidy another year. And a most unpleasant sight awaited him at the port. He saw another ship beside his ship taking passengers to go overseas, and it didn't take much imagination to figure out to connect the dots, because that ship had on the side the name of the ship, the Vanderbilt. And Cornelius Vanderbilt was saying, nobody tells me I can't do this business. I'm going to do it with no subsidy at all. So now we have Vanderbilt with zero federal subsidy, a totally private enterprise, taking passengers to go overseas. Now, the first thing he found out when he was going over is that it took a lot of fuel, coal, and wood in his boilers going overseas. And he said, although he went real fast, in fact, he broke the record. He had 11 days and a half days overseas. He broke the record. But he said, I can't continue to do this because I use so much fuel. Fuel usage, he discovered, is like gas usage that we would say today in a car. In other words, do we use fuel more efficiently when we go 50 miles an hour or when we go 80 miles an hour? Yeah. I was looking around, some don't know because they've never gone 50, right? I mean, you only go 80. But actually, you save gas more if you go 50. And so the same principle was holding here with Vanderbilt. So he had to go slower than Collins to save fuel because he didn't have a federal subsidy. So Vanderbilt was usually a day behind Collins. Collins might do the trip in 12 to 13, or about 12 days. Vanderbilt might be 13, that kind of thing. So Vanderbilt, but he thought, I'll make up for it by giving very cheap prices. He cut the passenger rate to $35. And the lowest Collins ever had it was $120. Collins started at $200 and went down to $120 and thought those were discounts. Vanderbilt went, now what he did, he figured out that if you pack, these ships would hold 600 passengers, sometimes even more. He said, if I pack people in about the way we're packed in here, they called it the sardine class. They were packed in as we are. And this is fun. We're hanging out. We're having a good time. If we were here for 12 days, we might start to get annoyed. Or sick, yeah, from the rocking of the ship.
Spinning around, roll compacted.
In fact, if somebody gets sick, then it clutters the room, and yeah, it's bad news. But how many admit that you snore, too? A few. My wife admits it for me. I snore. Well, and then they're crying babies, the whole thing. In other words, we're hanging out, having a good time now, but if we were here for 12 days, it could be different. And Vanderbilt knew that, but he said, look, a lot of immigrants, they want to come over, and we'll pack them in here, and if they can hang on for 12 days. Vanderbilt also made some money with the food. He helped invent the potato chip. Now, I know that would put him on Michelle Obama's hit list, with the calories and everything, but he called them originally Saratoga chips. And he would sell food like that to the passengers and make a little money on the food. And he also had full ships, so he figured if I can get $35 and 600 people, that may be better than if I charge $120 and only get 100 people. Because my costs are the same, roughly. Economists call this fixed cost. My costs are about the same whether I have 100 people or 600. And so if I give a discount, I can be sure to get 600. So Vanderbilt, the upshot is Vanderbilt had full ships. He was paying people about your age, people in high school, sometimes early college years, to go around and round up passengers, advertise for him, and they would get a percentage of the ticket of everybody they could persuade to come aboard his ship. So the upshot is Vanderbilt was having full ships, and at the end of a year, he was barely making a profit. He was making a profit, though, with no subsidy. Now, that made it very interesting in Congress, because Collins came back and said, this is awful. What's happening here? I need a subsidy this year of $858,000. And the congressman said, why this huge increase to $858,000? And he said, because I'm losing money because Vanderbilt's getting my passengers. So I had very low passenger rates last year. And I went into debt. And that's why I'm charging, I need $858,000 subsidy from Congress this year to keep in business. Congress debated Collins' request for $858,000. And I have a question for you. How many of you think Congress voted for and gave Collins the $858,000? How many think they gave it to him? $858,000, the whole thing. Our pessimists have their hands up again. It's pessimist row up here, and the second row too. Okay, it's getting more optimistic as we go toward the back. How many think they did not give him the subsidy? They voted against it. There, the back is strong. Oh, a couple in the front? Three, 4, 5 in the front. The front has totally been transformed on this boat. Okay. And this is kind of close. Let me take it again. How many think, yes, they gave him the money? No, they did not give him the money. By a slight margin, the yeses have it. But it's a real close vote. A slight majority says, yes, they gave him the money. And in this case, the majority is right. They did it again. Some were people like Senator Seward, who looked very good in our recent Lincoln film. He was a good Secretary of State, but as a senator, he favored Collins. And he got up and said, there are some people who are ready to desert their friends in time of need. Someone who's been loyal to us for years. Just because somebody for a brief period comes along and does it a little cheaper, you're ready to throw him overboard. Well, I'm not. He neglected to say he was supporting Collins with other people's money, not his own. But by a slight majority in Congress, the vote was closer in Congress, Collins did receive his subsidy. And after he got his $858,000, he was very nervous because he thought, that's a close vote. I've got to advertise. I've got to do well this year. And he thought, what can I advertise myself? What would you think he could advertise that he does better than Vanderbilt? Speed. I'm the first one overseas. Not that slow, Vanderbilt. And then he said, people who take Collins are elite people whose time has value. If you go on Vanderbilt, a day of your life is wasted on the sea. If you're important, go Collins. If you're an insignificant creature, just go ahead and take his ship and see if I care. And so Collins was pleading on the basis that he could save you time. He said, I'm the fastest ship overseas. Now, we found out after that Vanderbilt had a certain sense of humor. Because Vanderbilt instructed his captain to go fast out of New York port at exactly the same time Collins was leaving. So that in the distance, when you saw the ships, Vanderbilt was in the lead. And Collins had been promising the fastest service overseas. Well, it turns out that Vanderbilt told his captain, go fast for about 100 miles, and then slow down and let him pass you, let him think he's really turning it on, and then he'll waste all that fuel all the way to England. We'll slow down and conserve our fuel, but we'll put a scare into it. Well, Collins was nervous, that was true, and he was just ripping across the ocean. He went very fast all the time. He went too fast. How many of you have seen one of the versions of the movie The Titanic? Oh, most of you, I have too. That Titanic was not the first ship to crash into an iceberg and sink. One of the first was Collins, killing 454 passengers. Whack, right into an iceberg. Another ship came by, but they were an hour or so late. There were nobody survived. They found some of the wood, but the ship was a little bit there, but no passengers were alive. Collins had another ship leave Liverpool, England, April 1856, and still hasn't arrived. Now, there may be some bureaucrat in the Department of Interior still waiting for it. I don't know. But it isn't going to do Collins any good at this point. We think it must have sunk, hit an iceberg, but it just disappeared. What percentage of Collins' fleet has he lost? 50%. Now he can't do his regular Monday service. So he asks for an emergency request from Congress. An emergency request of $1 million to build a ship to keep him in the race. He wanted to ask to build 2 ships, but they said the other one might come up, still emerge. So they said, but we'll vote on one. So we're going to have a vote in Congress. Do we give Collins $1 million to build another ship to keep him in the competition with Vanderbilt? And I have a question for you. How many of you think? How many of you say, yes, yes, they gave him the money? The faithful 3. In the whole second row, it's big. Oh, but it looks a little lighter this time. We'll see. How many say, no, they didn't give him the money? Ooh. Let's take it again. It looks like the no's have it. How many say, yes, they gave it to him? Oh. No, they didn't. I thought the first time the no's had it, but this time I think the yeses have it. A majority of you said they gave him the money.
It's a simple rule of government. Why make one when you can make 2 at twice the price?
Yeah. Well, a majority says they gave him. Do you really think they gave him the money? No. Do you think they gave him the money? Do you think they gave him the money?
Yes.
In this case, the majority, and the majority did say yes. In this case, the majority
Why is there so much defense?
they said yes. They did it. They said yes. Collins tied $1 million and he built his ship quickly. He quickly built that ship with $1 million because the United States was going into debt so that he could have $1 million to build his ship. And he built it very quickly to get back in the race. He built it too quickly. Now, I was reading various accounts on the story of this ship named the Adriatic. And one of the books I read was by a naval man. And so, do you mind if I use naval technology to describe the problem with the ship here? The problem with the ship was that it, quote, it took water, end quote. In other words, it leaked. Only it was a leak that you didn't know until you're halfway across the ocean, which is not the best time to discover it. And those people aboard that ship became accustomed to this motion. Maybe that's the first government bailout. I don't know. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Yeah. Now, I know some of you are sitting there. He's got us up there. We're laughing and they're sinking and all that. They made it. Not a soul died on that ship. They made it all the way to England. They made it. They were so happy. I was reading one source. They were pleased upon arrival. Pleased upon arrival? I mean, I imagine they're getting off the ship. Oh, land! Land! Oh, kissing the ground! Dirt! Yeah, they were pleased upon arrival. And not a soul was dead, and Collins was all happy, but he was not so happy the next Monday when he discovered that not one person would get on board that ship. Not one. And he thought, what am I going to do? And he thought, well, I can recalk the ship, but it was built poorly because I built it so quickly. And they thought, I could sell it at auction and then take the money and do another one and build it right. And so he sold it at auction. And it was $1 million ship, and he knew he wouldn't get $1 million. But he thought, I'll get something and then use that to build another one. And so he sold it, and he took a loss. And the amount of the loss that he took on the ship was $990,000. In other words, he sold it for $10,000. So he made a penny on the dollar. Now, I read one account that said that's ridiculous, all the wood in that ship and everything for $10,000. And I read another account that said, yeah, that's about the market value of a ship that leaks. Yeah, I mean, that isn't worth very much. But Collins sold it. He got his $10,000. And he came before Congress and said, earlier I came and asked you for $1 million to build a ship. I come to you this time with $10,000 in my hands. It's right on the table toward another ship. I'm only requesting $990,000. And I have some this time with me. So Congress is faced with a request by Collins for $990,000 to stay in the race. And I have a question for you. And I'm especially looking at these rows here. But I'm looking at everybody. How many of you think Congress gave Mr. Collins the money? She thinks, he's not going to get me this time, aren't you? Get your hand up. If you're going to vote, vote with vigor. Okay. How many think, no, they didn't give him the money? Oh, we're going to have, this is another close one. I want to see it again. How many say, yes, they gave it to him? You can't raise two hands. Of course, I'm doing it. No, they didn't do it. The majority says no. And in this case, the majority is correct. That's right. Congress learned something. They cut him off. They wouldn't even give him his annual subsidy. They gave him nothing. No money to build a ship. No annual subsidy. Nothing. And I've had people accuse me of being cruel for quoting Congress on this issue. And here is what some of them said. Senator Judah Benjamin of Louisiana said, quote, I believe the Collins line has been most miserably managed. Senator Robert Hunter of Virginia said this, quote, the whole system was wrong. It ought to have been left like any other trade to competition. Senator John Thompson of Kentucky said, quote, give neither this line nor any other line a subsidy. Let the Collins line die. I want a tabula rasa, the whole thing wiped out, and a new beginning. And in 1858, we had a brand new beginning, no federal subsidies. And as a result, we spent no money on steamship subsidies. Vanderbilt continued to do his business and do so at low rates because the British Sea were crossing on the other side. And they had two companies, the Cunard Line, which is still in existence, and they had the Inman Line. They had two companies. So we had three steamship companies doing international traffic, all pretty competitive. The prices remained low. Vanderbilt was still in business, and the United States was spending no money on federal subsidies. We spent $11 million in steamship subsidies when all the time we had Vanderbilt available to do it competitively with no federal subsidy. We pushed the national debt up to $60 million by 1860, right before the Civil War. That means that 20% of our federal debt was steamship subsidy. It sparked a new era of spending more than we took in. We then, I wish I could say, we learned our lesson and never did that again. Which we might be able to say, by the way, if this story were in the textbooks so that more people could look at it. And then evaluate it. One of the reasons that Young America's Foundation encouraged me to write this book, and they published it, and have been distributing it for years, is that we wanted to get these stories out because we felt that if we did, that they would enter the arena better in public policy debate, and that people would say, well, wait a minute, should we do this given how these experiments worked in the past? Within 5 years, we were funding the transcontinental railroads with federal money, which, by the way, is Chapter 2. We gave the Union Pacific and Central Pacific federal money. In fact, it was going to be $60 million. We doubled the federal deficit just with railroad subsidies. Plus, we gave free land. We paid the Union Pacific and Central Pacific. Union Pacific was going from Nebraska to California, and the Central Pacific was going from Sacramento, California, to going. They were going eastward, and the idea was that the two railroads would connect. See, they thought, I know what we'll do. We won't just give Collins a subsidy. We'll give two people subsidies. Well, we had the same problems with both railroads. The Union Pacific, when it was going across Nebraska, did so in the winter and laid track on ice, which didn't work. And then they thought, wow, we're making all this money going across Nebraska, and so the railroad began to look like this. See, we get more money for more track, so they don't build a straight railroad. I'm from Nebraska, actually, and I talked with someone who worked for the Union Pacific recently, and he said, Folsom, they're still trying to straighten that track out. You know, they're still trying to get that track straight because it got crooked, so crooked to begin with. Because the more track you laid, you were paid by the mile, so the more miles you had, the more money you got. So rather than go straight, the railroad was going like this. Yeah, well, and then once we got to the Rocky Mountains, whoo! They just thought, whoa, and they just went up the mountain and down the mountain. And of course, no railroad can go up the mountain, and so the railroad really was not serviceable once they got to the mountain area. Then, once the two railroads began to get close to each other, they were getting close. Well, they were getting close. The Union Pacific could have written a book on dynamite, because that's what you use to blow up a lot of hills and mountainous type terrain to get a flat grade. They could have written a book, Dynamite, Its Uses and Abuses. One of the abuses, as soon as they were getting close to the Central Pacific, was sneaking over to the Central Pacific track and blowing it up.
Why?
Will you stop them from making any rail progress? And then, of course, the Central Pacific. Gee, I wonder what they did. Oh, gosh. Turn the other cheek, I guess, huh? No, they blew up the Union Pacific Rail. And Congress had to get involved, and they said, anybody who blows up anybody's rails doesn't get any federal money. And boy, that stopped them. No more federal subsidy if you blow up somebody's rails. Oh, then they ended up and they came in and they wouldn't connect. They both paralleled each other, and then we had to say, no, you will meet at Promontory Point, Utah. Then we finally had a meeting, and they have a picture in many textbooks of the arrival in Utah and the two railroads, and we were connecting them with a golden spike, and they all got drunk, and somebody stole the golden spike. And then that's the story of the Transcontinental Railroad. And it would be a bad story, except that James J. Hill, who had studied somewhat the life of Vanderbilt, said this is ridiculous, and he built his own transcontinental railroad with no federal subsidies. It's called the Great Northern. Do we have anybody here from Seattle? Ah. Do you study James J. Hill? No! Well, that's why we have the myth of the robber baron, so we can study James J. Hill. He ended up settling in Seattle. He originally was from St. Paul, Minnesota, and he built the railroad out there, and then he went all the way to Seattle. So we're over here in the northern part of the United States, and he built that railroad with no federal subsidies, and it was the best built railroad. It never went broke. In the Panic of 1893, the Union Pacific went broke, the Central Pacific went under, and the Great Northern Railroad turned a profit. It was a good, because first of all, it was straight, right? He didn't, none of this stuff. And he got a level route through the Rocky Mountains. He went back to the journals of Lewis and Clark to figure out how they got through the Rocky Mountains. And he said it had to be kind of a flat route, and he figured out that it was called the Marias Pass. And he got the Marias Pass and took that through the Rockies and had a flat route. A great railroad. Now listen, once this happened, it was the end. We said no more federal subsidies, and I'm happy to report, after the Civil War, we had virtually no federal subsidies, sometimes some protective tariffs here and there, but no federal subsidies to the steel industry, the oil industry, chemicals, and what we have, I mean, Herbert Dow in chemicals, John D. Rockefeller in oil, with Standard Oil Company, and Andrew Carnegie in steel. Those are the big industries of the late 1800s. The United States triumphed with free markets in a free economy. Low taxes, because we spent the 28 years after the Civil War running budget surpluses again. We look back and we said, we botched it up. What did the founders do? They reread George Washington. We had surpluses, and we got our country straightened out. Here we had this awful Civil War. We went $4 billion on it. We had a national debt that was almost $3 billion, and we paid 2/3 of it off in the next 28 years by having surpluses every single year. So politically, our politicians were doing the right thing. We were spending here, and we had this much revenue for 28 straight years. The United States became the place to invest, because a nation that shows that kind of discipline is a nation that can be trusted with investment. England, other countries came over here. The United States emerged on top. John D. Rockefeller, he had a market share, a world market share at Standard Oil, his oil company, a world market share of 60%. One American company refined and sold 60% of the world's oil. Now that's energy independence. That isn't just 60% in the United States. The world. Everybody in the world who bought oil, about 60% of it was from John D. Rockefeller, one American. And that's just one American company. We had other companies. He became the first billionaire in U.S. history. The first person to be worth $100 million was Cornelius Vanderbilt. He later sold his steamships and bought into the New York Central Railroad across the country. And what I'm telling you is that people who produce a good product at a competitive price, making a little bit on each one, became the mainstay, the core of American entrepreneurs. Andrew Carnegie's steel company produced half the steel in the United States and a lot of it in the world. He became the basis of U.S. Steel. American enterprise dominated the world. In a free market system with entrepreneurs, we put aside the subsidies, we balanced our budgets, got surpluses, we turned our entrepreneurs loose, and the United States rose to the top. Thank you. Yeah, Anna, we have time for questions. What?
We have time for a few questions. Anyone have? Pass the mic around.
Hi, Dr. Folsom. My name is
Yes.
Grant Wolf, and my question to you is, these stories of great success in a free market economy have such a powerful effect, especially on us as students, and I'm assuming if they were to be told to others that they would have the same effect. the fact that they're not, do you think that results from an intentional suppression or a general ignorance? And which is more dangerous, and how do we combat either?
Oh, that's a good question. The question is, why aren't these stories more widely told? And is this intentional, or is it ignorance, or what? First of all, it's a very good question. It's a very tough question because it requires me to get in people's minds. You know, what did you intend to do? I can do a little bit of this because I went through graduate school and had a PhD in economic history. So I know I can tell you what my professors were saying. And my professors never taught me one word of what I told you today. Not a word. Now that raises the question, did they not teach me this material? I had to learn it all after I had a PhD in economic history from the University of Pittsburgh, which was Carnegie's hometown, and it was where the Vanderbilt's New York Central ran through and all of that. My professors were not going around saying, uh-oh, keep the Vanderbilt story secret, Folsom's coming. They didn't know it. They didn't know it. In fact, I can remember when I first discovered it in the archives of the DuPont family in Delaware. They had a bunch of books on Vanderbilt and Collins and steamships. It was a historical archive, and I was just excited. I was just running through the stacks. Hey, does anybody know about this? And most of my fellow historians had never heard of it. A few more had heard of the Transcontinental Railroad story. But what I'm telling you is I think it's largely ignorance. It may be suppression in some cases, but by and large, I just don't think they know. And that was the excitement of why when Ron Robinson and Jim Taylor came by and Young America's Foundation said, Bert, we want you to write these stories up and we'll get them out to students. And that was a good idea. Because I used to go around and I'd say, how many have ever even heard the Vanderbilt story? And no one would say that. And I can't do that anymore because now when I say that, someone raises his hand and says, well, where'd you hear about it? He said, I read your book. You know, in other words, it is getting out, and it's even getting out into the public policy realm. And so we have a long way to go. But we're starting. The best way is to fight bad policy with good information and put it out there. Yeah. Another question.
Hi, my name is Zoe Harness, and my question is that throughout my education, I've been taught that robber barons were people who limited small business and treated their workers poorly.
Yeah.
And how do you respond to that? How can I respond to that to my teachers?
Oh, that's good. And we get into that because there's a chapter here on Rockefeller and on Carnegie and his successor, Charles Schwab. And so we look at oil and steel and all this. And you're right, they're called robber barons. We separate in this book, Young America's Foundation, I separate between political entrepreneurs, which are those who rely on subsidies like Collins and the Union Pacific, and market entrepreneurs, those who rely on producing a good product at competitive prices because they're making a good product, like Apple, you know, today, or like Vanderbilt and Hill back 150 years ago. And so this is the key there. Now, to the business of what about the wages that were paid the workers, this is where I wish we could get Milton Friedman back. He was such a good economist. And he would talk about it. He'd say, look, my mother worked in a sweatshop. She was a Jewish immigrant from Europe. She loved it because she had freedom over here in the United States, and they had pogroms or Jewish, wiping out Jewish citizens because they didn't have freedom over in Europe. And here she had a chance to work and earn some money and keep what she earned without having the state come in and steal it. So what I'm saying is the United States got almost a million immigrants a year during many years of the late 1800s. People don't get on a steamship, even if they serve great potato chips, come all the way over here, relocate in a new environment in order to be worse. The fact that they stayed here indicates the conditions, even though they were not great, were better than what they had overseas. And as we innovated more and more, they continued to get better. So that Milton Friedman's mother gives birth to Milton Friedman, and he becomes a well-paid and very accurate economist who helps his country and adds value to his country in a big way. Yeah.
Any other questions? All right.
Thanks. Good.